Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Let's Dev, where today we continue working on our dodgeball game with roguelike elements. Now, last time we basically remade our game from scratch in order to incorporate GameMaker's physics system. This allowed for a more unique experience that also served as a way to learn about said physics system. And so, the results were a physics-based version of our dodgeball-based game, with a bit of jank. Jank will hopefully be able to mitigate as part of today's plan. The focus for today is enemy behavior. We'll be taking our code written last episode and making it work for both the player and their CPU opponents. And hopefully by doing so, this will also allow us to fix some jank from last time and finally make way for the roguelike stuff. Sounds like a plan, so let's get to the coding. First up was taking each key press event and making them their own functions. Originally, the plan was to use a switch, but instead each event was made their own function. Doing this would allow the player and the CPU to use the same code via their own triggers. And so a new variable was added to determine which CPU triggers to check for. And the first change was the focal direction. For now, the player would always face the mouse and the CPU would always face the player. And so far so good, we were now ready to give the opponent some life. But first we had to make sure friendly fire wasn't a thing. So an owner check using enums was added to the ball to player collision check. This kind of worked. The CPU was no longer being eliminated by friendly fire, however the player's thrown balls would have no effect. So after some testing, it seemed that the last owner variable for all the balls needed some tweaking. Now, tweaks were already made off video in an attempt to curb some of the collision jank. This included resetting danger timers and owner variables during various events. And the most simple option seemed to be to constantly set the owner variable for any held balls, then pass that owner variable on during the pickup event because evidently I wasn't leaving anything up to chance at this point. The overcompensation was worth the effort considering this fixed the issue. Player thrown balls would now interact with the CPU opponents like they should, destroying them upon contact. And yes, to make sure only thrown balls would affect the opponent, a lot of uncomfortably close ball nuzzling was done. For science. Anyway, now that our ball collisions were finally in working order, we could continue working on the CPU behaviors. First thing up was making those CPU players move, so new variables were added for movement purposes. Then, like we've done with enemies in the past, a timer system would update the CPU's destination coordinates every few seconds. The CPU players would then move towards that destination point. And thanks to the physics system, the CPU players' movements was very clean and felt somewhat organic. So, with our CPU players moving pleasantly, it was back to the code for some action with the balls. A distance check for the nearest ball to the CPU players was made, and if within a certain range, they would prioritize moving towards that ball over wherever they were planning to move. And when within grabbing range of said ball, the CPU player would then grab it using the same function as the player. And thankfully, all that hard work of making the code universal paid off, with the CPU now being able to grab balls just like the player. So back in the code, a chance to catch the player's thrown balls was added to the CPU code. For now, the chance was left at 50-50, but clearly that chance is going to have to be lowered. Otherwise, this is going to be a very short game. Anyway, back to the code, new state and state timer variables were added. Then, if a CPU player is currently in possession of a ball, they would randomly choose one of a few options. Using a switch, the CPU would either decide to charge their throw the ball, or simply do nothing and wait for the timer to reset. And that process would repeat as long as they're in possession of a ball. These additions would also require some new arguments to be added to the throw ball function, since the original code only worked with the human player's data. And funny enough, before I could even test things, the CPU stole the ball right out of my hands. So a few more checks were added to prevent future ball theft, and there we had it. The CPU players were now able to basically do everything that the human player could. They could move, grab/catch balls, and charge/throw those same balls. And while the system isn't perfect and the physics seem to come with their own bit of jank, we have at least finally finished our base dodgeball mechanics for our Dodgeball Roguelite. So unless there's some crazy underlying issue that'll set us back, fingers crossed that won't be the case, we'll be able to start tackling some of the roguelike elements next time. But for now, that brings us to the end of today's episode of Let's Dev. So remember to leave a like if you enjoyed the episode, subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already, and leave your thoughts on our progress in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.